Welcome to all of you. You've met Tom Dunlay at least once before, but I think some of you probably have seen him three times with me. And he's back. He has a topic that he's pointed out to me, one that we used to talk about a lot with Gamble in the old days, and it has everything to do with museums and sort of what museums have been doing. And in the course of this whole thing, we're gonna talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly, you might say, about museums. But significantly, I'm going to follow your lead, Tom, and but it's and well, we were both there, for a lot of the conversation with Gamble, and I'm going to also right now, before anything else starts, I'm going to offer you all two different essays written by Gamble, which are really chapters of a book called Crosslights Studio Crosslights that never got published, and I don't even know if he finished all the chapters. One of them is Painting in Search of a Criterion,
Right.
And another one is on the light, the North Light.
Right.
That was a chapter. So it's the stuff that you might have seen, but you can get a number of these things through me and through this show, and at some point probably on both of our websites. But that's another time. But the two of them are called. One's called
The New Deal in Painting.
New Deal in Painting, which you've heard me mention before, and I talk about it in my own essay on Art and Revolution. And then the other one is
Tastemakers Triumphant.
Right. Okay, so you got those two, Tastemakers Triumphant, and so if you want to ask for them, do Tastemakers Triumphant. New Deal in Painting. They are chapters in sequence.
And they're particularly interested because they're really directed at a lot of the issues that have to do with museums today.
And the significant part of what we're talking about was introduced to us by Gamble as part of the greater package. We'd go to museums to look at pictures, and we wind up finding ourselves standing in front of pictures that were being deformed by the lighting and various other things, which we'll talk about. But before we do that, one of the great experiences I had just being in Boston was to see the Chardin show with 63, 67 pictures in it, with the most mind-blowing things. And this is, by the way, to start this off, we really do want to give credit. So we were going to talk between ourselves. A pre-planned conversation. You guys don't know that we've done this 2 times already before this, and we're not trying to change our schedule, but this is a lot fresher right now.
Sure.
This will be a lot more fun.
Exactly.
But that show, I mean, the pictures had never been seen in the U.S. before. Lots of them, and it was like when the Boston School was directly. That was one of their top 3 or 4 go-to guys.
Exactly.
Velázquez, Vermeer, Chardin.
Exactly.
You're talking about something really, really important to us, and for us to find it right in front of us in the midst of our studies was just amazing.
Well, that's why our topic tonight is so interesting, because we may come off being highly critical of museums, but as Paul was just saying about the Chardin show, the Sargent show, the Chase show, so many of these phenomenal shows that we've been able to see over the past 30, 40 years. The museums play an incredibly important role in society and in the training of painters.
Yeah, they're huge. As you can't, I know a lot of you are trying to copy pictures online and that sort of thing, and I know some of you are in remote areas and haven't got the ability to get to the museums. Do what you can, but to see a picture in person is massively important. To see a good picture by a good painter, you got to see how the paint is laid down. You got to see the brushwork. You got to see the actual colors. It's just hugely important. In the museums, when they do it right, when they've created a collection and light it well, so you can actually see it. They're doing such an incredible service to somebody who wants to be a painter.
Exactly.
And I feel like I own Europe, have spent so much time in front of the Met or the MFA or the.
Well, and I think one of the great difficulties with museums today, and again, it's one of the things that we're highly critical of, is that with the generation of museum directors and curators today, the connection with painters and the understanding of how great paintings of the past have been painted has essentially been lost. There's no understanding that Chardin painted his pictures in daylight and never imagined that they wouldn't be shown in anything but daylight.
Right. Yes.
And his goals and objectives as a painter can only really be seen in good lighting, good daylight. Yeah. So that's why for people like us, it's very frustrating, to go to the MFA and walk into a very dark room with spotlights shining on masterpieces, as opposed to God's daylight.
Tom, when you're talking about that, we're talking about a spectrum I mean, there's nothing in this room. I mean, we're using right now an artificial light that has nowhere near the spectrum of the daylight
Exactly.
of the North Light studio. And for you not to have that chance to see it, that fantastic show at the MFA with the Monet show when they opened up the skylights. You remember that one?
Oh,
And
absolutely.
you walked in there and you felt like these are fresh paintings. They looked like they were painted yesterday. You might even say here, because the notes are so live and so true to nature. It's such a huge thing, though, because people think if you go through the internet or you go through museums the wrong way, they're manipulating and altering things by accident even on the internet. But they can't help it, and so you wind up with an interpretation of a painting rather than the painter's presentation of nature. And so it's really funny. And so you start dealing with a thing that looks more like art and the new thing called art rather than this respect for nature and this approximation, this truth they were trying to bring.
Mm-hmm. You're absolutely right. And, painters like Chardin, Velázquez, Vermeer, Halls, they were all attempting to render nature as it actually appeared.
Right.
And they only had daylight available to them.
Right.
So that became the standard, that became the measure, for, judging the truthfulness of a picture. And today it's completely distorted by the lighting that we have in our museums.
Yeah.
And it's a tragedy that people, don't understand. And it's not their fault. It's the way things are simply presented to them.
Right.
But, my experience with people who, think that museums are perfectly fine in how they light pictures, I generally go through an exercise with them, showing them, a great painting painted in daylight and shown in daylight versus a great painting shown in artificial light.
Let me grab this picture, Tom, while we're talking about it. We'll talk about deformities, but not that one, but the one, this one. This is at the Gardner Museum. Tell us.
No,
you sent me this.
Yeah, this is
not the Gardner, the Clark Museum.
The Clark Museum in Williamstown.
Anybody who hasn't been there yet needs to go.
It's an extraordinary place.
It's a really
and one of
class place.
The great things about this museum is the main gallery, which is full of French Impressionist painters, mostly Renoirs, is completely lit by daylight. It's augmented by a little bit of artificial light for cloudy days and whatnot. Right. But as you can see in the picture, the entire ceiling is a vaulted glass ceiling going right up to the sky. And
the level of respect for the work.
Right.
That's what I'm saying. That was the whole wall of the Monets.
And the lighting, simulates very closely to the type of light that the pictures were actually painted in. So, seeing these pictures in daylight, you're actually seeing, what the painter intended his pictures to look like.
Right.
Whereas, if anybody who knows the Clark Museum and knows the phenomenal 19th century collection, if you go 40 feet to the left, you go into a room that is dark and dank, and there's absolutely no daylight. It's completely lit by artificial light.
But it's not dank, by the way. They do a good job with the air conditioner. Yeah. I mean, most places. I don't know what they do there.
But
that's a different story. But yeah, I know what you mean.
The pictures are all lit entirely by spotlights, which, cast a yellow light on the paintings and make it impossible to see them as the painter intended. Sargent's great Venetian alley pictures are in that room. And,
golden.
They're phenomenons.
They're cool pictures. Yeah,
they really are.
I mean, cool tone rather than
well, exactly. Exactly. Being painted in that type of light out of doors. But this particular gallery, the main central gallery at the Clark, is a perfect example, of how museums can show their pictures and how they should show them, and how most museums that were in this country that were built in the late 19th century or early 20th century actually did build their galleries. And tragically today, over the past 40, 50 years, museum directors and curators have chosen to cover them up.
And you could argue at one point that was about trying to save on electricity or heating or whatever. I'm saying you could, although most of these places still have very high ceilings, so that's probably not a legitimate argument. But the other thing is this whole fear of the of the rays of light possibly coming through and damaging pictures.
It's very true with watercolors, as
Right.
everybody knows. But oil paintings are, especially
These things have lasted hundreds of years.
Yeah.
The best things we've got in the natural light. They haven't been destroyed by UHV or whatever UH. What is that? UVs?
UV,
Yeah,
ultraviolet light,
Ultraviolet, yeah.
and up until the early part of the last century, lead was one of the main components of all these pictures. And as we know, lead is the single most durable paint that there is.
And it needs light to stay white.
Exactly.
It needs a lot of light. You don't put that in
Exactly.
a dark corner unless you want to lose your lights. in your
Exactly. No, you're right.
I was disappointed at the gardener when they went and found all these screens on the windows to protect for UV. You can't even hardly see the pictures anymore.
I know.
I mean, I've sort of come to the conclusion that those museums are just there to show that they have stuff.
Right.
Well, you can't get to see it.
The Gardner being a house museum is a little bit different. We can give them something of a pass. That was her home.
Yeah.
And
No, but that's new though. That wasn't when she was there. I'm amazed that they can still.
I know.
Yeah.
But they're so caught up in thinking that they're preserving the pictures by eliminating daylight.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate.
Yeah. Well, let's look at the other picture that is in natural light. You brought one in from
The Metropolitan. The Metropolitan
Metropolitan,
is I'm not sure if they're done or they're
that's
still
this one, right?
right.
The Metcalf.
Yeah, the Willard Leroy Metcalf of the is it the Black River in Vermont? I believe.
Yeah.
Magnificent picture, a masterpiece. Well, the Metropolitan is restoring its skylights. I'm not sure if they're completed yet, but this is a perfect example of what good museum lighting can be like and is today at the Metropolitan.
Yeah, that's a great thing to see. That's a great thing to see that move.
It really is.
There are a couple of museums. I'm thinking of possibly Hartford, possibly the Worcester, that do have skylights still and use them.
Right.
That haven't changed a lot.
Right. The Philadelphia Museum, actually their European collection their skylights are still open and augmented by some artificial light. But the most important thing.
Well, nobody minds that. It gets to be too dark. You can't see pictures at all.
Right.
Artificial light is a fallback. Yeah.
Exactly. But as Mr. Gamble taught us early in our time of study with him, what's most important is a clean, clear blue, even light, and yellow spotlights on a picture completely destroy the unity of a picture by highlighting one area.
That's one of the worst things. Yeah. What do we have? I don't know if we show one of those. We might have that though. Let's see what we have. Going back into the lighting. Let's not talk about that yet. This is one of those things that spotlights do. You said you took this one.
I did take that. Yeah, this is the Frank
MFA.
Duveneck at the MFA. They have a special room devoted to 19th century pictures, which I don't know why, but they hang it the room salon style, which I think is something they probably think is cool, but they hang pictures 3 up on a wall. And this particular Duveneck is up about 14, 15 feet. You can hardly see it. And when you do get an angle on it, you oftentimes get a spotlight glaring, right in the center of the picture.
We can be spoiled, us painters. I mean, this is a collection. And, museums show their collections. They're showing their collections. I mean, I don't really fault it, but if they could just eliminate the, and of course, by the way, if they'll just bring them down where they can be seen from time to time, shift them around so you can get to see them. But if they could just show it in even light and not put these single spotlights on them.
Exactly.
I can't even imagine you finding a spot where you can see that.
You can't. It's impossible to see that picture.
Yeah, I mean, that light looks like if you moved over here, you'd still have it in the frame.
You would. It moves around the room as you move.
Yeah.
And, I mean, on one level, this is a tragedy. This recent wing added to the museum was an incredible opportunity to produce magnificent galleries, much like in the original
The whole new
building.
wing is north facing, and they got big glass on it. It just blows my mind what they've done to that.
Yeah, the atrium is the best part of the museum. It's where you have your lunch in the cafeteria. It's all God's daylight.
But the north side, I mean, I didn't really mean to get into this just this way, but I don't mind actually, because that north side is so disappointed me when I saw the north side. It is dedicated to a hallway. A hallway.
Exactly.
And it's what's 8 feet. from the paintings
Right.
that have spotlights on them. I mean, like, explain that from a, talk about something like a forensic, a historically beneficial, where you can really appreciate a picture, the way it was painted and the light it was painted.
Exactly.
And you force them all into the wrong light, all of them.
Right. Well, I think the issue today is that, the curatorial world, they're so removed from how these pictures were painted. They don't understand it. They view them from a sociological point of view. When we talk about why a painter paints a picture, we talk about his creation of a fine design, handsome set of patterns within the rectangle, his attempt to gain a likeness if it's an official portrait. There's all sorts of elements, that a painter, the truth of the painting,
I like to use that idea of it being a pictorial magic, not story, not primarily story. If it's a worthy painting.
Right.
I don't know if you ever heard that from Gamble, but his adamant tone to me when I said I thought if at the show, that was a very excellent show of Leighton, Watts, and Moore. I came back and said, he said, "What did you think of the show?" And I said, "Well, you give me the drawing of Leighton, the color of Moore, and the ideas, the subject of Watts," and he screamed at me, "Subject is nothing." I mean, like right there on the spot, subject is nothing.
Right.
But that's the point, though. What people don't in museums, what they're getting, if the docents come in and they'll simply say things like, "You know what this is about? Well, why don't we talk about what this might be about? What was the artist thinking?" And, I mean, like that. But that's what painters are there to decorate walls, for one thing. But they're there actually to bring a different kind of pleasure, similar to music, but different. Just I enjoy it, which has everything to do with the design, the interplay of colors, the interplay of shape, as you're talking about, and various kinds of pattern, that sort of thing. The whole game,
Whereas if you read the official story about this particular Duveneck picture that the museum might put out, they might talk about his being inspired by the hat that the Koskian soldier was wearing, or some nonsense like that, or rather than the interesting pattern of lights and darks that he made posed against that wall.
I do wonder what docents might have said in the day when museums were dominated by painters. When the Tarballs and those kinds of guys were asked about things frequently, and were in that.
Well, no question that there was a much closer connection with the painting community and the museums at that time. I mean, if you remember, it was before our time, but Mr. Gamble in the late 1950s curated 2 exhibitions of Dennis Miller Bunker's work.
At the MFA?
At the MFA.
Well, how things have changed.
That's something that would be unheard of today. I mean, we wouldn't even get invited to an opening of a show, let alone be asked to curate something.
And then only what, 30 years later, to have his paintings rejected by the museum. Right. These paintings, there's 2 of his finest pictures, which are eminently worthy. I don't have them here, but eminently worthy of museum hanging. Right. Because he was so unusual in his time for the skill level, plus the fascinating mind the guy had. I mean, of course the subject was wrought with what is classic. In the sense of, when, it was always about, so subject, whatever that means. Right. But the subject was always about something that had to do with some grand historical. So it was always stories. Right. And he always would draw this relevance out of it for the time, that sort of thing. Fascinating stuff.
And if you remember, he actually never, ever talked about his pictures from a subject matter point of view. I mean,
it's true, not to us. Yeah. I never heard him say a word.
I never ever heard him say
it.
And I think the idea is what you were just saying a minute ago, is that it's not the subject matter that should determine whether a picture survives and is considered fine and worthy of being called a work of art. It is the simple fundamentals of a good design, a handsome design. How a picture is executed. It's those things that transcend generation to generation.
We can go, Tom. One of the things that you should probably between us, we should probably introduce Gamble. A visit with the museum with Gamble. You do his voice so well. I mean, can you imagine Gamble seeing this? We're still talking about lighting, but this is what's happened to museums now.
Yeah.
And this is again, this is Tom, this is, you know, you can see why I would invite Tom in for this. This is him,
Well,
his
when
material.
we would go to the museum with him, and it was probably 2 to 4 times a month. We would go to the MFA, which was literally 3 blocks away. So we made it a constant effort to go see
Yeah.
various pictures,
Yeah.
and going with him, it was I found it really incredibly fascinating, to get his point of view, because
Right.
it was such a different world, 40, 50 years, prior to our arrival on the scene.
Right.
John Sargent was alive, Edmund Tarbell, Frank Benson, William Paxton. These were the leading painters in the country, let alone Boston. And
Yeah.
going.
Well, Sergeant of the World, I mean, he had a huge following worldwide. Yeah.
Exactly. And the museums at that time respected their opinions. They came to these painters constantly for advice on understanding the importance of pictures, how painters should be represented, how their work should be hung. So for him to go from living and experiencing that kind of world to in the 1970s, when the skylights had been completely boarded up.
Yep.
There was no regard for how pictures should be properly hung. It was very frustrating for him.
Well, he watched that 70, in Tastemakers Triumphant. He's talking about this show in 1972, the great celebration
Right.
of the museum or whatever. And he said, you walk in there and they've painted the Sargent murals over there. They've painted the walls the wrong color. He's totally wrecked the whole entire presentation. It was done with architects and the painter all involved.
Right.
And they totally screwed it up. And so him to see that, they would do that.
Yeah.
He also observed the overcleaning at the library of the Sargents there. But the overcleaning is a whole other subject we can get into in a second. But I want you to do this. What would Gamble say? Everybody's sitting here looking at this picture. We're walking the museum, and around the corner we come. I want you to ham it up. Let's hear this, because this is real stuff. These guys have much better voices than me for the camera.
when we would go to the museum with him, I mean, he would become terribly upset at the sheer fact that there were artificial lights shining the pictures. So for him to see something like this, he actually would have simply left.
I wonder if he would have actually had a heart attack. I mean, he took that stuff so seriously.
He took it so, and he cared so deeply. That's
just wrong.
Right,
I can imagine using the words.
It's like so many things in our society today that are black and white. It's the old question of 2 and 2 equals 4, but today a lot of people are going to tell you it's 5.
Yeah.
And putting it,
well, that's the whatever world of modern art, right? Whatever.
Putting something like this next, is that a Morse? Is it a Samuel Frisbee Morse?
I think so. I think it's Samuel F. Morse.
Yeah, I didn't take this picture, but hanging something so disruptive to all the pictures around it. And as we were talking,
disruptive. Look at the light on that picture. It's totally screwed up. Screwing the light up and wrecking that painting that's next to it.
Right. He I can't even imagine how he would have felt. I mean, he would have felt that all was completely lost.
If you happen to think of one of the stories where you can use your voice, please treat our folks.
I will.
But the thing about this is, what are curators even thinking when they do stuff like? I mean, this is a complete and utter, number one, disrespect, but number two, it's a failure to do their job.
It is a failure.
They're wrecking their own materials.
I have a very definite feeling on this, Paul. I think this is a deliberate attempt to intimidate the public into simply accepting whatever the museum tells them.
Stuffing it in their face. Yeah, some vicious kind of
the art-loving public, the average museum goer, is very tolerant, and they go, they want to see these great things. And most people go to the museum, with the whole idea in mind that I don't know very much about art. I know what I like. If they're told something like this, is the equivalent of what's hanging next to it. Some people will accept it. In the museum, they're very good at writing storylines. And telling the public that things of this nature are the equivalent today
Yes.
of what someone like Sargent was in his day.
Yeah.
And
So you're now you're talking tastemakers.
Right.
You're talking Gamble's very point.
exactly.
Please do order that from us. I mean, you're not order it; you'll get it for free. But
It-
if you
it's
want
a-
it, just let me know.
It's a phenomenal essay, and if you want some understanding of where museums are today and what got them to this point,
Right.
he outlines this very clearly with a very clear
Yeah,
timeline.
it's not opinions. He's actually naming names
Yeah,
and talking
and,
about.
and he lived during this period, and he knew these people, and he actually
He knew members of the boards of these museums that were doing
Right,
it,
right.
things like this.
Yeah, I mean, he traveled in the same
He
social
knew the
circles
thoughts
with them.
they had when they were selecting their curators.
Yeah. But
Firsthand.
in the late 1920s, Harvard University they recognized what was happening. The older generation of knowledgeable painters and able painters were beginning to die off. Sargent died in 1925. Monet died in 1924, I believe. Edmund Tarbell died in 1938, and there was not a
By
generation of
41,
painters.
Paxton was gone. That was it. Yeah.
There was no one coming in to fill this void. And then Harvard University recognized this, and they actually started a program to deal with the problems of museums in today's society. And this became the training ground for museum directors and curators through the 1930s, right up to present day. And in most museums across the country, you will see some influence of this program from Harvard University.
Well, Gamble was saying in his own day that most of the major museums were already in the curatorial hands of graduates of the Harvard the FOG program under Paul Sachs.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
So it's really important to, in a sense, to know this stuff. I mean, I always talk about it to people. Just look at pictures, understand that you just do your job. On the other hand, this is a what, Tom, you're talking about a minute ago. This is where we are because what happened. The reason there was no good picture painters by the time you get in the 50s, I mean, there's so few painters that are of any value. It's because they already had undermined the entire school system.
Right.
Which wasn't the ideal form in the first place. But, painters should have taken responsibility and created ateliers the way Gamble did. But I'm not saying anybody, nobody had that thought, really.
And there were so many influences, Paul, in the sociological aspect of it is huge. With World War, starting with the Franco-Prussian War, the loss of the number of painters on both the French and German side was really, profound. Then you have World War One, and then you have, the Depression, and then you have World War II, and all of this has a huge impact on the educational system for training painters, and it virtually became impossible to attract good painters, or there were no good painters around. That particular generation of painters did not train the next generation the way they were trained themselves.
Well, the generation that I grew up, say the Art Students League, where I worked with no fewer than probably 6 people, there was no systematic training of any kind.
Right.
There was no, I mean, they had a place where they would talk about drawing, but it was scribbling, it wasn't drawing. Right. And you look at, and I remember looking, they had in the cellar of the Museum of Fine Art, the Art Students League, they had catalogs with the drawings from McMonnies and people like that in the classroom.
You can look at it and you can see the drop off.
Well, no, I just looked at it and I walked up to the register and I said, where are they teaching this?
Yeah.
That's what I was there for. Oh, that's everywhere. Everybody teaches. No, honey. But I mean, I'm a little kid. I wasn't doing that. Although I was, it was a difficult thing because and I also was one of those guys, which I think a lot of our audience are, who just don't accept the second rate and the fifth rate as being, we're just stuck with that. And isn't it sad? Or not even isn't it sad, but that's real. That's the real thing. Instead of, you got good eyes. You can see this great history. We all can.
Right.
And now that you got the internet, you can see everything. What are your aspirations? Are they low? Are they, what we're getting out of the Ashcan era, and not all those guys, but there's a significant body of third-rate and fifth-rate painters there that begin to be extolled all over the country.
Right.
The guys who are dominating the Art Students League, the 3 different brothers whose names I forget, but they they had no skills in the great sense of learning of drawing, learning how to see. There's no evidence anywhere at the Art Students League after Dumond was gone
Right.
that there was any
Well,
systematic training of any
you remember
kind.
what happened in Boston in 1914 when
Yeah.
Benson, Paxson, and Tarbell, when they took over the school, I think it was 1896,
Right.
they were given complete autonomy on how to run the school.
Sure.
And how to train painters, what the program would be, who would teach what, how people would advance. They had complete control.
And they themselves, having been through a system
Right.
where they learned what worked and what didn't work for themselves.
So
Yeah.
in 1914, the museum went back on its agreement and hired an administrator to run the school and determine what the program would be. And
Was that Edgell at that time, or was it somebody else?
no, it's actually in the Tastemakers Triumph.
Okay.
It's in that series of essays.
For some reason, I'm picturing.
Yeah,
him, but
I don't have the names in front of me right now, but Benson and Paxson and Tarbell, were men of great integrity. And when the museum went back on their arrangement, they all
walked
quit.
away. Yeah.
And what's hard for us to understand is they were the superstars of their day.
Right.
They were the Larry Birds and the Magic Johnsons and the Tom Bradys, of society in that day. And actually made
They were extolled in the newspapers.
Yeah,
I mean, whenever they had a show, they'd get major write-ups.
Exactly, and it was front page headlines when they quit the museum school.
Yeah.
I mean, Benson, Paxton, Tarbell quit museum school. I mean, it was serious news.
Yeah.
And
And people knew who they were.
Right.
Yeah.
So what happened was that void was filled by, a group of less well-trained painters who, and the program was adjusted too. People weren't given the kind of studio time that they were given under, Benson and Tarbell. And things began to gradually decline. And then we had 1914.
And that is a museum-based school, so it's not like we're talking about schools elsewhere. We're talking about that.
So if you go to the old museum school catalogs,
right.
and you look at everything from 1896 up to 1914, you see a consistency in the quality of work, all nature based, and the drawing is based on the antique. Still lifes and portraits are painted from life, and really quite remarkable work. And then after 1914 when they quit, by 1920 you see an incredible drop off. Yeah. I mean, it's like someone.
Of course, that's worldwide too, and
right.
We talked about that on this show before. Where I now have I think no fewer than 8 different places across the globe where they walked the cats over
to the river,
threw them down threw them over the bridge, threw them into the elevator shaft. The list goes on. But I get calls from people with stories from the funniest, unimportant little places that was like systematic. It was like something. What's going on?
In Boston, they walked over to the Mass Ave Bridge at the Charles River and did it.
Yes.
Yeah, there was a day. It was a celebration.
What's wild about this, though, is don't you know what the Renaissance was based on? It was on studying these cats. It was based on the Greeks.
Right.
Studying the antiques, studying them, copying them in sculpture, drawing them.
Exactly.
I mean, so the entire Renaissance, this sudden outburst, this birthing of fantastic beauty that just kept exploding, just kept flowering. We decided to eliminate that somehow. Now, I mean, where's that decision made?
The other contributing factor, was a classic case of supply and demand.
Right.
1896 to 1907, 1910 or so, there were only so many places to go study painting in America.
Okay.
And what happens 1907 to 1914 is the expansion. If you go look at every major university, places like Yale, all the major colleges and universities throughout the country, if you go back into their records, you'll see that their art departments all start around 1907, 1914, in the very early teens. Yeah. So all of a sudden, you have program, an art program at Rutgers, all the
Denman Ross at Harvard.
Right. At all these universities, and you don't have enough qualified instructors to run the program. Right. So what happens is they produce a generation of less well-trained painters, And then you have all the
Well,
influences.
but Tom, they weren't doing the hours you would need,
Right.
the lab hours, as you would put it in any other field.
Exactly.
I mean, none of these guys were getting 20 hours a week in the
No,
studio.
not at all.
There's no way you're going to learn to
And
paint
then
that way.
and then you have the influences coming in from Europe, the modern and
We're wandering way off the museums now. But I'm sure people are enjoying our running on with this. But
and in the role of the museum, particularly the Boston Museum in its early days, was an educational center.
Yeah.
And the museum from 1876 to 1914 did probably the best job in this country of
some people were saying it had
having
taken over
educational system.
Some people said it took over from the École des Beaux-Arts
Right.
as the lead in the world at some point.
It really was.
Yeah.
I mean,
And now we know that the École doesn't even teach drawing. Isn't that interesting? Not even drawing at all. They don't have a department.
Right.
Yeah, that's one of my students went over there and toured the place and asked about it. Specifically asked about show me the drawing stuff. They don't do that anymore.
Yeah.
So
but
that's another question, which I'd rather we stay on this subject and maybe attack that on a whole different day.
Well, it's the old assumption we've advanced to a higher level and we don't need drawing anymore. It's only the ideas that count.
Well, that's one of those things.
And the picture we have on the screen right now,
that's good.
Frank Benson from the Chicago Art Institute, which is one of the most extraordinary paintings ever painted by an American. It's his two daughters out of doors on North Haven Island. For that to be hung in a room where whatever this is to the right of it, is they're attempting to have the public believe that this is the equivalent of what's hanging all around it. Yeah. It shows that we've just reached an extraordinary time in society. And I know, people will say, "Oh, it's fun. It's art," or they'll say, "Well, can't you talk to the curators?" And
well, but still, let's keep running through stuff that the museums are doing and that sort of thing. But again, though, let's keep on remembering the contributions they've made to our education. I mean, by these amazing shows they've had and continue to have. So, as much as this is what they do on a routine basis, which is. And probably this is the part that bothers me the most about what they're doing. I don't consider this erudition. I consider this some form of what's the word, editorializing. It's simply bringing their whatever they got in their heads. Right. That doesn't seem to have anything like an awareness of the great conversation that's been going on through the entire history of representational painting.
Prevailing attitude of the past 50 years that everything is art.
The old whatever model. Yeah.
Right. And everything is art, and we have to consider it, all equal.
Right.
And I think it's simply the lack of understanding of, what painting is, what it has been, and we're talking about a tradition that has lasted 500 years.
Right.
And what we have here in this particular picture is something that's come about in the past.
In a blink.
10 or 15 years. So it's hard to measure it against what mankind is considered to be fine and beautiful and noble.
Interesting. This would not. You talk about this stuff on the right there. You probably wouldn't be at the bottom of this picture. You probably wouldn't have defined art as fine art if that was the sort of the typical of what was happening or the lights going on there. I don't know where the word fine fits into that. Do you know what I mean? A lot of it's jokes, a lot of it's clever, but it's the word fine is a very interesting word. I don't think you would come up. And even the word aesthetic. I mean, would that have ever been evolved from a body of work that looks like this or that light bulb?
Well, it's like when we were students in the early days, and the term conceptual art was being bandied about. Where it put the idea ahead of the execution, and this is the classic example. With you have to be able to interpret what the maker was trying to conceive here.
Whatever, but the point is, I've seen some really beautiful work done with metals and with with enamel and with plastics and with glass. I've seen some amazing things done. It's still not in the same. It's not the same animal, and it's one of those things you can do it and call it wonderful stuff.
Right.
But to stir it in as if it were the same thing.
Exactly.
That's all that's my only point. I don't mind. I love a lot of this. I'm astonished with some of the skills that people are showing in the, if you want to call it the crafts,
right,
in the pure crafts,
sure,
arena. I mean, I'm impressed as heck with a lot of it. But
why
do we call it
what's
the same
interesting,
thing?
and I think the crafts have gone through the same issues that the world of painting has gone through, and I know in Boston at the turn of the previous century, there was a craftsman's guild. It was actually on Newbury Street across from the Guild of Boston Artists. It specialized in contemporary pottery, metal work, things of that kind, and it was a subject that was taken very seriously, and it was its own world, and it didn't try to compete with painting or sculpture.
Right.
And it had its
But
own.
it had its own aesthetic.
It
The
had its
beauty
own
was at the
aesthetic
root
and
of it.
standards.
Yeah.
And I think today, what has happened is this sort of, just running it all together. Everything
Well, the
is
cleverness
equal.
thing is what drives me crazy. But look, we're talking about modern art now, and I've committed myself to talk about our values.
Right.
So let's go back to the museum again. Let's look at a couple other pictures just to
Okay.
finish that part of the
Sure.
discussion. One of the things that would happen when you go to the museum with Gamble and immediately start talking about these big, heavy shadows that would be typically off a certain light. It would be casting a big shadow onto the frame, and it would distort.
And that's the problem with artificial light and spotlights. Whereas the Clark Museum gallery that we were talking about, the light from one side of the room would actually light the pictures on the other side of the room.
Yeah, the even wash of light.
So it was an even wash of light, and the light at the angles on the curve of the skylight was actually shining towards the pictures on the other walls. So there was no opportunity for a cast shadow to occur from the frames, which gave you, beautifully even lit pictures.
Sure, yeah. Well, that's just one of those things that these guys could do better. The museum could be a better place for those kinds of works.
Right.
And museums are full of stuff. I mean, there's the Egyptian, what do you call that kind of geological, or we're not archaeological stuff. And there's a lot of amazing stuff in the museum. But this section is its own unique thing. This is painting, fine art painting.
Right.
What's so hard about keeping that stuff clear of all this other junk? It's no big deal. That's what I said, but they seem not to have that skill. But then worse than that, they deform these things by the way they light them. In Gamble's day, you remember that Gamble would come in and he would talk about how bright the walls were. Mm-hmm. And that's going back to that, unfortunately.
Right.
But how it's diminishing the center of interest in a picture.
Right. Exactly.
And when you get a red wall, like you've shown in one of the two of these pictures here somewhere, if I can find that, when you get a red wall like this, you see that the reds, which are frequently right there bouncing as key to the center of
right, exactly.
At the center of interest, and here they are being eaten up by the walls.
Exactly.
Those are the kinds of things that Gamble would have been really frustrated by. Is that one of those big dark shadows? Maybe it's not, but these things actually seem to not have those shadows getting into the picture.
Yeah,
which is better.
That room, it does have a few side lights.
I should be doing this with there.
Yeah.
We can use that if you're ever inclined to. We can use that.
Right.
Or give us the red light, the laser.
But oftentimes, especially with a curved cove molding, the spotlights will shine down on the upper part of the frame and literally eliminate, as much as a 20% of a picture.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, as I'm saying, when you're looking at these paintings, you really can't see the palette of a painter when it's in that artificial light to start with. But the worst part is when they do those spotlights and they glorify and hyper lighten some section and diminish the rest of it. So there's actually a circle of light if you get back far enough, or blur your eyes a little bit. And the sides, and they recompose the painting by doing that. Now that's a priesthood interpreting God, to my way of thinking. You know what I mean? Are you going to tell me what God meant here?
Well,
and God's the creator.
And that goes to your earlier point of the subject matter being all that they can relate to, as opposed to why the picture was painted.
Yeah.
None of these pictures, I would dare say, were conceived, because they wanted to paint that subject. They were painters, they were picture makers, they were designers. The pictures had a specific reason for being painted that goes way beyond what the subject was.
Yeah, no, you get back to the question of beauty, and something comes across when Nang says that. you're drawing an ugly leg, I would see beauty in that leg. If I was drawing that leg,
Right,
you
right.
wouldn't be an ugly leg. But
It-
that capacity, that's that special thing that
Right,
makes an
right.
artist what he is. He's the guy who's got the capacity to see the amazing, the wonderful, the magical
Right.
in nature,
Well, they were
and
taught
to bring it across.
they were taught to understand what the truth, meaning the appearance of nature, was and how
Right.
beautiful it was,
Right.
and that was one of the primary goals of interjecting that into their pictures.
Right.
In continual search of the humble truth.
Yeah. Yeah. Did we talk about the side by side? This isn't damaging the picture next to it. It's just being kind of chronological.
Well,
So there's a certain-
and this is another thing that goes back to what I was saying about museums attempting to validate work that is clearly of a lesser standard workmanship wise. The
But
picture,
also a truly different genre of painting.
a different type of picture, completely. I'm clearly aware that there are some people that think this is a very fine work of art, but what it mostly does is it does not relate to anything in the room. So I think there's a deliberate attempt, across the country, and it's probably, a directive that was, given by the museum, curators association or whatever organization runs museums, that now we're going to have a pattern of hanging pictures that may be disruptive to everything else in the room.
So you can't enjoy the 19th century
Right.
Hudson River School or something.
It clearly is a distraction, and what I think, again, as I just said a few minutes ago, it's a deliberate attempt to and confuse the public. And
I think of it as a guy with no clothes on running across a baseball field.
Exactly. Right. Yeah.
That's sort of the way my mind works. When I see something like
Exactly.
this.
It
is offensive, though.
What do they call that when people do that at weddings and whatnot? Was that
What is it called?
streaking?
Streaking.
It's sort of a modern day streaking affair. But we don't have a picture of it this evening. But the Boston Museum is particularly guilty of this in the Sargent room. They have that one.
It's
room.
not here in this collection.
Right.
No, okay.
The Boy Children hangs, and probably 40 masterpieces by Sargent.
Right.
And they have a contemporary portrait by an artist that is so wildly different, a modern contemporary artist. The work is totally unrelatable to everything else in the room. And they actually tell in the story, in the little placard beside the painting, that this particular artist today is the equivalent of what Sargent was in his day.
Yeah.
And they have nothing in common.
Well, at least in the times back in the day of the sort of the Tarbell era, where those people had influence, at least they had knowledge of painting.
Right.
And so you have people choosing these pictures for what reason? Where's their skill level? How do they make the determination that this somehow belongs, even on the walls at all? And so I go back to wanting, Gamble would talk, and I don't mean Gamble, the whole world talks about the 100 years. Famously, pictures have to thaw the assize of time.
Right, right.
So, but the assize of time is you and me going to museums. It's people buying them over and over, and some people having bought them, put them in the cellar, thinking, and then before you know it's gone. Now, sometimes it happens to good pictures, but there's a routine like this. That is the judgment of time.
Right.
And I'm suggesting that maybe we need to get back to that. But the idea of putting contemporary pictures, contemporaneous guys, we have guys painting from photographs, which none of these guys were doing, in the room with guys who would never paint from a photograph.
And again, in this particular gallery, and many of you may remember seeing it, there was a contemporary painter whose work hung in this room, and it was very highly featured by the museum.
Right.
And it was something that was done entirely from photographs. And the justification the museum had in hanging it was that even though it was done from photographs, this represents what all of these painters in this room would be doing today if they lived today and had photography available to them the way this particular...
Had been undercut, it had been thoroughly undercut in terms of their education. Yeah. Yes, that would be true.
I hope that some of... The picture is not hanging anymore. I hope it's because of our vocalness and objecting to it.
Very strange stuff. But again, editorializing for what purpose? So to me, what's happening today in this era, both in the arts, from the early days is the politicization of painting. The art schools now have become thorough. I mean, this is a silly thing, but obvious. Hotbeds of left-wing activism.
Exactly.
The places like the Mass College of Art that used to actually feature really seriously good painters like Majors,
Ernest Major.
Majors, people like that.
One of the last great teachers.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't even DeCamp teach there for a bit.
DeCamp did?
Yeah.
For quite a long time.
So we had these good painters, and then you find these guys are spending an entire month making a wall of pictures, making an entire show of pictures, black pictures, to raise money for the communists in Nicaragua.
Right.
I mean, what is this about? What is this now? And that's, to me, this is one of the great. One of the things that you all know when you see me here. This isn't what I talk about. We talk about beauty. We talk about the stuff that is the redeeming part. But everything is beginning to be used now, and it's the manipulation of us, of us the viewer.
It is,
and it's to the detriment of us, the painter, who want to learn how to paint. We're being injured by all this stuff from way back in the schools.
Exactly.
The losses through the schools in the 20s and so on.
And as Mr. Gamble says in Twilight of Painting, the younger generation of painters coming along are being robbed of their rightful heritage.
Yeah.
They're not even being exposed to what good painting is.
So so many of us, all of us, I was born in the modern era. I was born in the era of abstract expressionism. That's the 50s. I was born just the other side of the 50s. You're on this side of the 50s, which are right there.
Right.
That's what was hot around us. So we look at all the pictures around the world. We don't see that stuff. We see Michelangelo still. We see the Renaissance. And then when you get to know more, you see, even I think Encyclopedia Britannica had a Sorolla in it.
Right.
I mean, of all the amazing things. And I'm sitting there looking at this stuff, and I say to you guys all frequently, don't I say, don't forget what brought you to the dance. But this is pure inspiration. You want to be a factor here, as much as if you want to write poetry. You aren't going to be inspired by stuff that doesn't even sound like it, and that makes you sick to your stomach.
Right.
You're inspired by the stuff that is nutrient. It has a nutrient base. That's something of value, where you're bringing something good to your neighbor. You're bringing value to your neighbor. Out of this world that you've begun to see with your own eyes, and has given you a vehicle for doing so, etc. Yeah.
No, you're absolutely right. And I know we're talking about museums, but again, it all comes down to the breakdown of the educational system that this Boston in particular so established so well.
Yeah.
I mean, they're like you were saying, they were the equivalent of the École.
The Art Students League. When I was there, they had, I think, about 60 painters. But they had modern abstract painters, like Witzel and maybe Hans Hofmann, I forget who all was there. And they had representational painters. And they sat there like this, doing their thing, side by side. No big deal, but nobody confused them with each other.
Right, exactly.
I mean, they were doing paintings.
You were one or the other.
Yeah. But you weren't confused about it. You weren't being told there, no, you mustn't go paint the figure and try to make it as beautiful as you can, whatever. You're studying the figure.
Right.
And if you're doing with the other guys, you were studying something else, the borrowed abstractions of painting, the color relations and things like that, and making that purely abstract play. Gamble would speak very well when he would say, "Don't you understand? That's borrowed from us. It's sort of reduced what we're doing to half of what
it was lip service."
Well, it's okay. I mean, I don't think so. I actually found beautiful color. Like some of the stuff by Georgi Kepish I use as examples of beautiful color and texture. But that's a different world than the representational model. That representational model had to do all those things. It needed to be doing all those things. And it was doing more. And so some of it was the connection with the human being. I mean, literally it was us. And that's lost in the abstract world. And so you're now in a form that's what you might call, you could say it's pure music. But I haven't found it to be that. There's something about it they wrote in.
Either that or it's pure noise.
Yeah, but even when you're talking about Beethoven, whatever, you're feeling nature in this stuff. And I don't mean you're saying you're seeing cows on a field because it's a pastoral. Right. I'm saying actually you feel the resonance of the world that you're in. And I'm not seeing that in the modern abstract world. I'm just saying now, I'm just being silly. But I did have the respect for what they were doing at the Art Students League by separating them and saying, here. But that was just because they hired abstract painters and representational painters.
And at that time, like you said, it was coming out of the representational painting world, the traditional world.
Yeah.
you know,
But they weren't trying to force down your throat something weird.
today
and say this is the same
today
thing.
what's going on, you know, people have no understanding of paint at all, you know,
Yeah.
the beauty,
Yeah.
you know, what can actually happen with paint. And we've turned into a plastic world where,
Yeah.
you know, the world has been convinced that acrylic and plastic is, you know, so much better than natural pigments.
Yeah.
Which you know is a great contributing factor, you know, in the art of oil painting, you know, is the, you know, the materials themselves, you know,
Yeah, the evolution.
you know,
Yeah.
the lead, the oil, you know, the
Yeah.
you know, the earth pigments, you know, the metal pigments, you know, they have a tangibleness to them, you know, that, you know,
I was talking to
create pure beauty.
I was talking to an architect just a little while ago about what's happened with modern architecture, and he said, well, modern architecture is what it is. I like some of it. I don't like some of it. But he said what's happened is the CAD programs.
Mm-hmm.
He says they're taking the life out of it.
Yeah.
Everything has now become a mechanical process. AI is making a world that isn't human, isn't fit for humans.
Right.
And, I mean,
Whereas we should be entering into a period of extraordinary beauty, you know, with the ability to prefabricate and, you know, design, you know, take classic design elements and incorporate them into the CAD programs. We should have, you know.
Well, no, but he's saying that what we've lost is the actual human eye,
right,
and the human hand, and how much that actually contributes
exactly
in the irregularities and all these things. And, you know, but he's saying, don't you see? You're taking the human out of it. It's taking the life out of it.
Exactly.
And that's a fascinating thought to me. Yeah.
Well, and I think we've had this discussion before. You know, the training of architects at MIT at the turn of the previous century and at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris.
Right.
You know, the first 2 years you were trained as a painter. You know, life drawing was the primary requirement of architects, you know, so that they would have an understanding of the human form and how it would relate to architecture.
Yes.
And that's something that is completely devoid today.
A fascinating assumption, too,
Yeah.
that it would. And I think that's one of the reasons why representational painting is what it is. I think you can't escape the necessity of making the connection to us, to have the same profound level of interest. You know, the thing I talked to some of you all about is that study that was done by the UN. I don't know if it's still doing it, but every 5 years they put out a poll to see, for whatever reason, is this fascinating, to try to gauge the interest of the public in modern art. And I don't remember, they would probably just use a word like that, and you'd get this thing where you couldn't get above 15% ever.
Right.
In the entire 50 years they were doing this. Nobody understood it, nobody cared. And so if you're talking about the modern abstract art, you're talking about the dehumanization, the disconnect with the human. And that's fascinating stuff. But to make a tube of light spin around in there next to a thing that's talking about us, I mean, what is that again that you're doing? Except maybe dehumanizing.
I mean, we've got, I think, even beyond the point of dehumanizing it, we've just simply got to the point of pure novelty.
That's real, isn't it? Yeah, that is true. And by the way, good for you. I mean, I like novelty as well as the next guy. It's got just why
I just don't like it in
the world of aesthetics.
I don't like it in a museum next to it.
Would you like it in the food you're eating? You know, novelty for its own sake, or do you want to have something of nutrition? We sort of have gotten that, haven't we, in the modern world? Let's think of a couple other pictures you have here. Tom, we're going to have to get to that subject of the overcleaning stuff. So here's one more picture like this.
Right.
We don't have to talk at length about that, but just another example.
Right.
Side by side.
One of the, you know, premier pictures ever painted by a Boston painter, the Child House in Boston Common at twilight.
Right.
And the museum chose to hang a picture that is so unrelated to it.
And so dominating by effect on that wall. I mean,
exactly. It's a real distraction. It takes away from the picture completely. It's the antithesis of what the Haslam is. And, you know, we don't have a wide shot over the room, but the rest of the room is filled with, you know, some of the greatest turn of the previous century pictures ever painted, you know, in Boston. And
well, this thing on the right, though, is as much as I'm giving credit to Georgi Kepes, you know, you probably knew as well as I did, but the guy was actually has an aesthetic modern painter. I don't find anything about beauty in this picture. I don't find it's totally a different class of animal. So now chaos becomes the equivalent of order, and you see what I mean. We've totally devolved, and why museums would participate in that. Or actually be part of creating it is what blows my mind.
Yeah,
that's the thing that fascinates me.
And the Haslam to the next of it, as you can see, is carefully thought out. It's well planned. You know, it's extremely well designed. It's
Well, it's pleasing to look at just on the face without people understanding
exactly.
that. Right?
It's pleasing. It's beautiful. It's truthful.
Of course, it's under artificial light, which is really screwing it up.
Exactly.
So it's a good thing it's making it through all that.
To get onto the other problem with museums today, the overcleaning of pictures.
Yeah.
The Gardner story it's an incredible story, and it's a story that the world is completely unaware of. And this is the famous painting, The Concert by
Let's take that back.
Vermeer.
This isn't that. This is that.
Right.
This is the
This
famous
is
painting.
This is a,
You talk about it. You
this
talk
is
us through this.
This is a 1914 photograph of The Concert by Vermeer, which Mrs. Gardner bought. The picture represented in this photograph was supervised by Philip Hale, who wrote the famous book Jan Vermeer of Dell.
Really, in many ways, put Vermeer on the map.
It did. It was the first serious study of Vermeer's work. Yeah. And to this day, because it's written by a painter, someone who actually understood Vermeer's objectives as a painter, understood what he was doing, what his pictures were all about, that book is particularly valuable. But
to painters, it is really, I promote it on
right.
here. So again, if you're not familiar with this, I think I may even be able, you can go online, PDF it online. You can find it.
It's an
I think you've got to make sure you get the early version.
Right. You have to get the 1914 Bates and Company edition. It's a big red volume. The later 1938 volume was edited by Charles Caffin, was it?
Yeah, and his wife. And
his wife, yeah. And it's full of omissions and
it's taken out some of the best passages actually from the original book. And Gamble was the guy that points that out to us.
Right.
Gamble would have known way more intimately. He was there with Paxson.
Right.
Paxson and Hale collaborated on this. Anyway,
how do we do the hour?
Yeah.
Here we are.
You want to go? Yeah,
so what I want to point out about this particular Vermeer is this passage that you see here.
Yeah. Pure atmosphere.
This whole area here, which is in what we would call a penumbra of shadow. Right. Now this glare here, where it's a little lighter, is simply due to the curvature of the book when I took the photograph.
That's a good thing, because I was going to critique you on that.
Right, so. but this whole area, it is a large mass. It's meant to be completely unified by the value of the picture. Right. This area here is it's a subordinate value, but it's large, flat. And both of these masses are to set off, the centers of interest in the picture.
Right. Flat, by the way, means relatively uniform in value. That's
right. Uniform in value, but you will see lots of variation in terms of tone and color going on within the value.
Yeah.
So this figure is a stabilizing element, leading you into the center of interest, and you're brought in by this big value here. But what I want to point out that's so extraordinary is that this, if you look at this part of the picture here where I'm circling, has complete unity to it. Now, something that no one knows about is that this picture was seriously overcleaned. It was literally destroyed in the 1970s. And now here is one of the last contemporary photographs taken in color. You can see that this part of the picture was,
it's pretty much intact.
Is pretty much intact. The light areas, simply because the pigments used in the light areas, were much stronger and less susceptible, to the conservators, heavy hand. But what I want to point out it really was a crime was this passage here. You see how you can see the dress? You are not supposed to see this. This value here should be much like this value here. The light source is coming from over here, and this figure should be casting a complete shadow on the whole lower section of her dress in this picture. The
values have all been messed with.
The values.
Somebody's added drawings to this Vermeer.
They've been completely destroyed.
That's about as bad as the things a museum could do, actually.
Right, exactly.
That's amazing.
Now, I happen to have been with Mr. Gamble when it came back from the cleaners. And
could I say something about Mr. Gamble, though, in this?
Sure.
He would have known this picture intimately before any of this damage was done. He would have known it firsthand. And he would have been sent there by the museum school to look at it at the Gardner
Exactly.
Museum.
And he actually knew Mrs. Gardner and would, frequently go to her house when she would open it, to the public once a year. So from the time she acquired the picture, until the mid 1970s when it was overcleaned, he would have seen it on a regular basis.
So this is what he told us. What he told you. That's what we're going to get to.
Yeah, this is what he told us.
Right.
And also, I'd like to point out if you see the cuff on the woman's jacket here, you'll see it's sort of a spotted leopard type of cuff. Now, this area here, you see sort of evidence of a cuff. This was actually added by the restorer, who, when she was asked, why she added it, she said, "Well, I thought it improved the picture," which was extraordinary.
Can you imagine yourself improving
but
it there?
Mr. Gamble was so upset, when this picture came back from the cleaners. And if anybody has access to the Gardner Museum's records, Roland Van Hadley was the director at that time.
Right.
He was actually a close personal friend of Mr. Gamble, and there's quite a bit of correspondence that went back and forth between them over the overcleaning of this picture. Right. But the museum, they denied that anything had happened. This is a classic example of one of the things that's most problematic with many museums around the world today.
Well, so then the overcleaning problem. And so I was telling people I've told them in the past about the Bouguereau that I saw when I was a student, when I was a kid. As a 15-year-old, I looked at the toes on a Bouguereau, and anybody who's seen a Bouguereau knows what I'm talking about.
Right.
And I go back 17 years later after being in the Army and all the other stuff and studying painting. I go back there, and the toes have been reduced to outlines. Mm-hmm. And I went to the museum curator and asked him what they'd done. I said, "What have you done? Did you send this to a restorer? Or when did you send it?" I said, "When did you send it to a restorer?" Mm-hmm. And then I said, "Where was the restorer?" And it was a Texas restorer.
Right.
And I said, it's been overcleaned. You know that, right? He said, "You couldn't. How do you know that?" And I said, "You couldn't." He said, "You couldn't possibly know that." Well, that's a thing that's been happening fairly routinely, and one of the things. And by the way, those two side by side is worth a look.
Yeah, this really points it up quite dramatically.
Except for your smear over here, we got to get a better shot of that.
And that's what's
So
the term for that is that the picture's been skinned.
Skinned.
So the top layer.
And so we watched while they were doing that to that hand. That hand is one of those things I'd go in and look at that museum for. This is a Gilbert Stuart of General Knox, and Revolutionary War era. And there's this hand, and all of a sudden it's reduced to something. I didn't show the one here by the Tenerado. It's obviously been skinned as well at the fog, but I don't know. It might have been done before they ever got a hold of it. I'm not saying it wasn't. But that's a fascinating issue. We haven't even talked about deaccessioning paintings and stuff, but that thing is done by museums. They take responsibility for it. And I know a guy that studied at the museum's restoration or whatever department, and he said they come in roses and they leave as orchids. Right. I don't know what that is except arrogance,
exactly.
but this one is one that we were both there when this was being.
Paul and I were both there, and I remember going to the museum with Mr. Gamble when it was hung after its recent cleaning. And you can see this is the Duke and Duchess of Morbilli by Edgar Degas, and you can see the forehead here is literally, it's like he was given a lobotomy.
Yes,
completely deformed. Completely removed.
This is a master of form.
And you can see the form, how it's shown, and the rest of the head, the cheekbones, the nose, the zygomatic arch. But all of a sudden, this
paint
is
like this or paint like that, and that's what's happening up there.
But the forehead, it has a pasty look to it. It almost looked like someone put a pad of those stickums on his forehead.
Yeah, and again, here you have a guy like Gamble, who's a longtime student. These pictures have been there. He's been looking at them.
He first came to Boston in 1911, so he knew these pictures from the time they were acquired, until 1981 when he died.
And he expressed shock at what they were doing.
This was a Gamble moment at the museum. I mean, he was completely outraged. And, immediately went to the guard and, asked him who was responsible for this. And
you went to the guard?
And
the guard just by chance happened to know.
I mean, just the exasperation of, seeing something that, he clearly cared about.
Right.
You know, he wrote a really extraordinary piece on Degas called "The Shop Talk" of Edgar
Yes.
Degas.
Yeah.
You know, it's known to people who studied with Mr. Gamble or have studied with his students. It was never published, but it's an extraordinary volume on Degas, and
It was published. I mean,
well,
4,000
privately,
copies
right,
privately.
right. So in terms of anybody from Boston knowing about Degas, no one knew more than him.
Yeah. So we've talked about the overcleaning. We've talked about the editorializing with the spotlight effects. We talked about putting pictures side by side that are shock your grandmother tricks. You're looking at a wall here that has a painting and that has a piece of sculpture of the same era. That's the kind of stuff that's logical in a museum.
Exactly.
You're trying to show the work of a period of a time. I even was in a little house museum in Denver where they had rooms dedicated to eras, and they had the 50s, and I was really impressed with the move from Art Deco to something different in the 50s. The cars, the toasters, everything had this unity of. There's a reason to do that in the decorative and the arts form.
I mean, most museums traditionally
Yeah.
have been set up with timelines.
Yeah.
That show the progression, and particularly Boston was always set up that way. You had specific rooms that were, pictures of a certain decade, a period, a time, were all hung together, and then you went from room to room.
Or you could go to the room. This is a study moment.
Right.
You go to the room.
Right.
I mean, the Spanish, the Italians, or the 19th century, which is what the Gardner was doing. So, Tom, did you get conversations from Gamble about the deaccessioning issues? Did you have that, or is that strictly in the writing that we've seen? The question of deaccessioning, throwing out.
Well, yeah.
So the museums are doing that. At the Metropolitan Museum, for example.
Right.
When I was there as a student, I could have bought Bouguereau's on the street for $1,500.
Right, exactly.
I saw them on the walls. I don't know which galleries, but I was on a lot of walls. It might have been Hammer for all I know, but I don't think it was Hammer, but some serious galleries.
Right.
But that was happening, and Gamble talked about in his era that they were sending him out the back door for nothing, getting rid of 19th century.
I do know the story of Mrs. Paxton. William Paxton died in 1941, and because of the First World War, the Depression, and then the onset of World War II, and the change in taste and fashion and what museums were interested in the advent of modern art. What was happening was her husband's work was actually being deaccessioned by major museums around the country.
Right.
And she spent from 1941 until 1970 or 71, when she died, trying to buy up as much of his work as possible.
Before it's totally devalued.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, so there's that thing. There was a devaluing. And then simultaneously we were watching, in our time, the Rockefellers buy up a bunch of Jackson Pollocks, for example, for like $1,600. And then having the museum, where they had connections, the Metropolitan Museum, buy them for $67,000.
Right.
So we're talking about museums, and this is not the pretty side of museums now. We're talking about some really interesting stuff that has to do with culture, with affecting the future, our future, with changing our culture out from their little whims, as far as I can see. Well, it's not the flow of nature and the flow of the sort of the natural movement or evolution of a culture. Well, this is not weird.
I mean, you remember our own experience back in the early 80s, the MFA deaccessioning half a dozen
we did have some fun,
really fine pictures. The Willard Metcalf that they owned, May Pastoral, which I consider his masterpiece, maybe his greatest picture, even better than the one that we just showed from the Metropolitan Museum. They deaccessioned it, and their reasoning was that they felt they had better examples, and also they wanted to use the money to buy modern art. And there were half a dozen. It was Frank Benson, a phenomenal portrait. There was an Edmund Tarbell, a Sargent, a Chase, the Willard Metcalf, and
we did demonstrate on the streets in those days.
We were on the museum steps with placards and all of that, protesting it. We were real rabble-rousers at that time. But it all fell on deaf ears, and the museum did sell them, and then and many of them
Excuse me for keeping on looking. I keep checking the time.
But and many of the pictures were sold, with the argument that they had condition problems, and miraculously, most of them showed up on the open market several years later.
Yeah.
And
a whole bunch of people. I think even Nelson Shanks was buying them up, but Ross bought lots of the Bouguereaus at that time.
The pictures no longer had condition problems, and they sold for small fortunes, and they all entered the best private collections around the country.
Yeah, well, when you think about that, how many of their friends,
Yeah.
I mean, we're just still talking about a world that was never fascinated by modern abstract painting, the way it was moving, and the junk that stood up there. You read that fascinating book on Cézanne by a painter, by Christine Herter, and Cézanne is saying, "I'm just trying to do what they were doing," and it's kind of almost pathetic, and he couldn't manage it. But all of a sudden, these things, bought for nothing, suddenly become they get marketed into something vast, and museums play a role doing that.
Well, in the traditional world, the way great paintings have been made for centuries, moves at a much slower pace. If you think about the expansion of the art market, where the pictures are sold, and it's simply a commodity, and there's a lot that goes on in the art market, that has nothing to do with art. It's about money, false investments, money laundering and whatnot.
Yeah, we see all that now.
And the traditional world, is a world that's based on workmanship and quality, whereas modern art can be turned out very quickly, very inexpensively, and
it can be whatever, as long as you get a marketing guy that knows how to say things about it. Yeah. Read Tom Wolfe's Painted Word. Tom, we're going to have to quit on that note. I don't know. We probably don't have many minutes. I'm going to thank you now in case we get cut off. Okay.
Thank you, Paul.
I really appreciate you bringing this to us.
Always great fun.
Yeah, we wandered, but it's all fascinating stuff. The one thing you have to say, you may not appreciate the old age in one way, but there's something about the collection of this information and the way, the fact that you actually get to piece it together, you get to see the larger picture over periods of years.
Exactly.
That really makes this conversation a benefit.
I recommend everybody listen to Paul's videos, because the way he does it weekly, extemporaneously, things that mean something to him, just sometimes continuing on to other topics than he originally intended. You're getting the real.
Not as bad as we did today, usually, but
no, but you're getting the real story, and I liked what you said earlier. You're getting a sense of studying with someone, listening to them on a daily basis, and Paul is a wealth of information here.
Yeah, and I do sustain that, just for your information. And by the way, Tom has just opened up his own atelier, your own teaching studio, so you can be in touch. If you're looking in that area. You're down in Dorchester, West Boston. Where are you?
Norwood, 10 miles southwest of Boston, down by Dedham, Dover, that area. If anybody is inclined to, work in a traditional studio, painting from life, drawing from life, figure portraits, still life.
Yeah, and this isn't the new realism. This is actually what Gamble was teaching, which is much closer to the base, the museum school base.
Exactly.
Than that was.
Yeah. I mean, as Paul, the nature, is the complete goal. To understand and render nature as she actually appears, as opposed to.
Well, at least be a student of it first, and if something comes of it, there's a mat. There's that thing about nature being the source.
Right. Teaching to see, no tricks, no techniques, just simple, the humble truth.
Yeah, Tom, this has been fun.
Great fun.
I bet you we're still at 2 minutes, but we can talk on for a couple more seconds. But the one thing that came to mind talking earlier was what was going on. You're talking about Yale and all these schools taking over. You never saw product coming out of those, but Gamble was even insisting that really what you needed was the atelier, the small, the one master and a small group of people, working with that person one-on-one in close proximity where you could be aware of everything they were doing and be on top of their progress, as well as leading
And
them.
as James Deleuze, the French sculptor said, where you can, start with a museum, go to the studio, then go back to the museum. This constant interplay of, and that's why museums are so valuable.
Absolutely.
In the training, it was
really
an integral part of ours.
Right.
I mean, we went to New York once a month.
Well, when I was there, of course, I went there every day, every week, But
exactly. But I mean, Mr. Gamble, he would send us.
He would send you down. Yeah.
He would
That's where I met you guys.
Right.
You guys came down there.
Exactly.
A friend of mine knew you from the whatever it was, the Henchy world.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
I knew you guys from the Impressionist world. But
So that's why we this whole topic this evening was devoted to museums, because it's such an integral part of the training. To be able to see great pictures the way they were painted.
I'm still getting us into the space with Gamble. Where Gamble said, no, what are they thinking, or whatever. I remember the time he brought in Stebbins and started screaming at him, you idiots will never understand.
Yeah.
It was just
it's unimaginable that someone with your intelligence would, think this sort of thing. You have absolutely no understanding of how these things were painted or why they were painted. You're
doing just what you're doing.
You're more concerned with who they had tea with or what train they traveled on to Paris, rather than what they were trying to do as a picture maker.
But even in those days, Tom, I was people who know me know that what I'm trying to do is talk about the thing.
Right.
But Gamble would so frequently would go to the museum and it would just turn into this rage at what the museums were doing. And we never found him to be wrong. It was impossible. We saw that he was right.
Right.
And it was so disturbing, though, to him that he would frequently break into this stuff, and to the point where you wondered if you were going to get anything out of it about painting. But you can't blame him. It was happening right in front of us in the 70s. Nothing's gotten better.
He lived through the last golden age of painting.
Yeah.
And Sargent was alive.
Right.
Zorn was alive. Chase was alive. Hassan, Metcalf. They were all around him everywhere. Blashfield, the greatest mural decorator.
And he knew many of them firsthand. Many he knew.
Kenyon Cox, Maxfield Parrish, all of these people were contemporaries, and he knew many of them.
Carried on correspondences with these guys.
So to be Charles Hawthorne, he was friend of Hawthorne, a student of Hawthorne. Richard Miller in Provincetown, the great painter of interiors. Sergeant Kendall. He knew all the Joseph DeCamp. Joseph DeCamp advised him on taking the entrance exams at Harvard in case painting didn't work out for him.
I sort of had a suspicion that he might be a writer. Or something.
To live in that world in 1910, 1911, and then flash forward to 1975, when all these people were completely forgotten. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to imagine. You open up American
artists.
It's
heartbreaking to him. And for him to, it's like the decline to the whole thing going into a whirlpool down to hell. And he's sitting there having no power. One guy.
No power. And to go from a period when Metcalf is the standard for excellence in landscape painting to the 1970s when Emil Gruppi is considered the god. For him to live in that world, I mean, it had to be traumatizing. And so, thank God.
So I don't fault him. That's my point in saying all that stuff.
Exactly.
I don't fault him. And I also don't entirely fault the museums. They've done a good job in a lot of the stuff they do. I mean, they do have collections we can still see, and most of them they haven't ruined them a lot. But these are some of the things that are just near tragedies, though, from the point of view of a person who loves this field, loves this world.
Exactly. Yeah. No, you're 100% right.
So that's my positive spin on this whole thing.
Remain positive.
We're going to call it a day. I think we're at an hour and 30 minutes. So if it turns into 3 shows, you'll understand why.
It'd be fun to see what he hashes out of it.
Thanks very much.
Thank you again, Paul. It was great fun.
All right.